Good afternoon, everybody, and once again, welcome to the Warsaw Security Forum. My name is Hadley Gamble, and I am the Chief International Anchor for Al Arabiya, as well as a contributor to Semaphore, and it's a fantastic opportunity to once again welcome an amazing group of panelists. We're going to be talking about Pax Americana. It is at the end of Pax Americana, and as an American, it's a tough topic to even be contemplating, but I suppose we're just going to have to work our way through it. I just want to mention that everyone on this stage is an American, with the exception of one man. Just to welcome my guests, it's fantastic to have them. Kurt Volker, former U.S. Special Representative for Ukraine's negotiations. We're also joined by the Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of Democracy and Humanitarian Rights, Dafna. Nice to see you. Lord Vernon Coaker, our resident non-American, Minister of State for Defense for the United Kingdom. We're also joined by General David Petraeus, who's the former director of the Central Intelligence Agency. And I'm also very pleased to welcome James Carafano, the Senior Counselor to the President for the Heritage Foundation. Panelists, welcome. I think it'd be just a moment, and I'm sure it'll make everyone really uncomfortable, but I'm going to do it anyway, to take a step back and say, we are just a few weeks away from the election of a new president. And this could have major implications for our foreign policy, but also our domestic policy as well. And I want to get a very brief sense from the folks up here on this stage of who would be better for America, Kamala Harris or Donald Trump? Kurt?
That's really a very difficult question. Here's the way I look at this. We have, in the United States, always flirted with isolationism. At the beginning of the founding of the Republic, George Washington said, avoid entangling alliances. We had the America First movement in the 1930s. Franklin Roosevelt really had to struggle to get the U.S. to deal with World War II and Nazism, and it took Pearl Harbor to get the U.S. to do something in World War II. We are in that again. And I'll remind people the campaign slogans that presidents have used to get elected over the last 20 years. President Clinton, it's the economy, stupid. President Bush, no nation building abroad. President Obama, we're going to end 2 wars. President Trump, America first. So this is a trend. And I'd say there's a passive form of isolationism, which is we want to avoid escalation, we want to avoid conflict, we need to manage crises, but it's always also with a view towards we don't want to take anything on unless we have to. And then there's a more proactive isolationism, which is what you get from some of the America First crowd, the MAGA crowd. James can comment on that. As a country, for the last 70 years, we've traditionally had people from both parties believing in American leadership, an international role for the United States. You know, our values are our interests are our values, and we have to stand up for our values in the world and our interests in the world. That's always been there. It's still there. It's not gone. This exists in both parties. But we are facing now in this election more prominence to either the passive or the active form of isolationism. And it's a tough call.
I didn't hear an answer there. Dafna?
Sure. So I would just add onto this discussion of agree with the natural vacillations between isolationism and internationalism by making the point that America and its very old democracy are really based on an international foundation. And beyond the political elite and the foreign policy leaders, we have a very generous group of people in America who have long given charities abroad, who are very committed to international causes. We have universities that are increasingly building ties around the world, and that is without regard to political party, to state, to who's the president of the United States. So that, if you look at those trajectories alone, are only increasing. We have cities that are acting really as international centers of commerce in the United States, whether San Francisco, Chicago, or even smaller cities. So the engine of internationalism is way beyond the Beltway, beyond Washington, D.C., and that is only growing the interest in exchange programs, in commerce, in tourism, and I see no end to that internationalist impulse among the American people.
Lord Coaker, who would be better for the West?
Well, you'll be pleased to know I'm not going to answer the question because it's not a matter for me to to comment on American domestic policy, and it's a choice for the American people to make. But what I would say is that I think it's important to remember that the US and Europe have always been indispensable allies to each other and important allies to each other. And I think it's really important that in today's geopolitical climate, the UK and Europe need each other. And I made the point this morning that what happens in the Indo-Pacific affects Europe, what happens in Europe affects the Indo-Pacific, and as such, I think the UK, with the US, with Europe, and with our other allies across the world are going to need to stand together to deal with some of these crises that they face, and they'll have to do that together. And I think that will be true whoever were to win the next American presidential election.
General.
So I stopped voting when I was promoted to 2 stars, and I haven't started since. And I don't endorse candidates of either party, and I actually advise candidates of either party who are serious. So I'm not going to answer the question, but what I will do is say that I think regardless of who wins the election, it won't be the end of Pax Americana. Obviously, one candidate is a little bit more associated with America First, but actually that didn't translate into true America First. If you look at what happened in NATO during that period of time, we returned tanks to the mainland, European mainland. We pushed our headquarters out into Poland. In fact, he loves Poland. They were going to name Fort Trump for him out there. So again, I think you can overstate what the results of this might be. Certainly one a bit leaning in one direction, the other would be much more status quo. I'm a little surprised that an actual member of a political appointee of the administration dodged the question, and we might return to that. But I think, again, the U.S., by and large, there's bipartisan recognition of the importance of U.S. leadership in the world, but very much with allies and partners, because the number of plates that we're all trying to keep spinning simultaneously, representing the different challenges and threats, is greater than at any time since the end of the Cold War. And the biggest plate in that tent, bigger than all the others together, which represents the U.S. and Western relationship with China, that one has to be rock solid. And as our Lord here recognized appropriately, what happens in one part of the world reverberates in others. And if you want deterrence to be solid in the Indo-Pacific, which rests on a potential adversary's assessment of your capabilities on the one hand and your willingness to employ them on the other, if you don't come to the help of a country that is threatened, its very independence is at stake, that embraces the same values and principles that we in NATO do against a dictator, a kleptocrat who is animated by a grievance-filled, revisionist and revanchist view of history. If you aren't going to support them, who's going to believe you that you're going to come to the support of someone directly, not just enable them to preserve their independence? So I think that recognition will still exist on Capitol Hill as it does right now, despite the lengthy, overly long discussions before the latest extraordinary amount of aid, $61 billion, was approved some months ago.
David, do I get an answer from you?
So I can't believe you asked the guy on the far right. Who's, here's what I will say with absolute 100% certainty and confidence, that regardless of who wins the President of the United States, America is not leaving NATO, and we are not abandoning Ukraine. I think it's true.
Applause.
I think what the exciting differences are going to be on energy policy, Middle East policy, Latin American border security, and Africa. I think those are the things that really might turn in different directions depending on who wins.
Yeah. General Petraeus, and I do want to pick up on that just with regards to the Middle East. Considering the amount of military hardware that we've moved into the region over the last several months, I would say 6 months to 12 months, given what happened in Gaza, that looks like mission creep to many people. What does this
actually, to a former Central Command commander, it looks like rationality. We have always been irrational in our effort to leave the Middle East. We used to have 3 CENTCOM truths, we called them, when I was privileged to command the greater Middle East after Iraq and before Afghanistan. The first of those is, in the Middle East, be very clear who your enemies are and who your friends are, and don't confuse the two. And we have it a little bit at times. Iran is our implacable enemy, dedicated to the destruction of Israel and getting the U.S. out of the Middle East. Israel and the Gulf states and others are our friends, even if there's periodic friction and disagreement on certain specific issues from time to time. Number 2, Las Vegas rules do not apply in the Middle East. What happens there does not stay there. It tends to spew violence, extremism, instability, and in some cases, tsunamis of refugees, not just into neighboring countries, but all the way into the countries of our most important NATO allies. And then number three is that this effort to leave is just not rational. The U.S. trying to leave the Middle East is like Michael Corleone trying to leave the mafia. You just keep getting sucked back in. So we should recognize, again, I'm not saying that the current level is necessary, but certainly these efforts to constantly pare down, unsettle our friends and allies, and embolden Iran and its malign proxies in the region. So I think, again, and with great respect, I'm not sure that the difference will be that profound in the Middle East. The current administration is supporting Israel just about 100%. Israel is being enabled to do what they believe is right, even when in some cases it's somewhat at odds with some of allies and partners, including some of our administration, doing a remarkable job in decimated. They haven't just decapitated Hezbollah, they have decimated their leader structure. They have done enormous damage, 1,500 targets alone to the much feared, in many respects, Hezbollah capabilities to simultaneously hit Israel and overwhelm the integrated air and ballistic missile defense system. Really impressive operations there, frankly. Although need to keep encouraging, there needs to be a vision for an end state for the Palestinian people in Gaza, which is lacking right now. It needs to be based on security that has to be achieved before you can really bring that about.
Do you believe that the United States needs to have a central role in that plan?
Oh, absolutely. It does have a central role, and it is. And again,
in the rebuild of Gaza?
Well, everybody's going to have a central role in that. The reconstruction, this is where the Arab states will come in very much, and others, but you can't do that without security. And security means that you don't have Hamas reconstituting after every single raid, and that the place is not run by criminal gangsters and remnants of Hamas.
Lord Coaker, I have to ask you, I'm now living in London, so I'm a UK resident, although an American citizen, so this is very personal to me. Keir Starmer's government so far has managed to avoid at least the UK press. They're not doing any interviews, they're not really talking that much beyond this narrative that things are really bad and we got to work hard to change them. In your mind, how does this set up the United Kingdom to avoid the conversation that we're having right now? Is this the end of Pax Americana? Is this the end of United Kingdom's influence abroad?
The UK's influence around the world. Yeah, no, I mean, I think the Prime Minister was very clear at the United Nations, where he was a few days ago, where he talked about the UK's importance, the importance that the UK attached to its global role, not on its own, but I think, as has been said by others on the panel, working with our allies and our friends across the world. We keep making the point. Obviously, we have a NATO first policy. That's really important with respect to what's happening with Ukraine. We've been clear about that. We've said that, and the Prime Minister has said that at length. But that doesn't mean that we don't recognise the importance of what's happening in the Indo-Pacific. And that's why, for example, the Carrier Strike Group will go there next year. It's been very clear about that. And we're looking to work with our friends and allies across the world, through NATO, but also through our other alliances. AUKUS is another really good example of the sort of work that we're doing to ensure that the UK plays its proper place in the world. And as I say, what the Prime Minister said at the United Nations was really important about that. And the UK will play its part. It can't do it on its own, but we cannot turn away from the global challenges that we face. Everybody in this room is united by the desire to protect freedom, the international rules-based order, and democracy. That can't be done by one nation on its own. We need the US to work with us to do that, of course, but it would be the US with the UK, with our allies, many of whom are represented in this room. And that's the geopolitical reality of the challenge that we face today. It wasn't where we expected to be. If you'd have asked us a few years ago, perhaps many of us, including myself, would not have foreseen where we are. But we are where we are now, and the response that is coming, irrespective of the result of the American presidential election, I believe that people across the world, in terms of our alliances, including the US, will understand the importance of standing up for those freedoms and those rights. The US has always done that, and I think will do so in the future. And it's important for all of us that we work with the UK, we work with the US to deliver that, because it's in all of our interests that it does so.
And the UK, we should remember, walked point for many of the early decisions when it came to supporting Ukraine. First one, hundreds of anti-tank guided missiles. We all watched, nothing happened. U.S. plows in thousands of them. Same with the longer range anti-ship missiles. Same with the longer range Storm Shadow. Repeatedly, the UK has made the first move. U.S. watches and then piles on with enormous assistance.
It's that relationship.
Yep.
I would just add on, I couldn't agree more, and I would actually reframe the Pax Americana paradigm that you've organized us around to, the post-1991 expectation that democracy would teleologically or naturally be on the march. That's what we're recognizing in the past 10 years or so, that we have to do much more work to protect, promote it, and to prevent authoritarian revisionism. And, credit to President Biden for really understanding this, this diagnostic and framing a lot of his geopolitical concerns in this maybe, binary between democracies and authoritarian regimes. But essentially, post-1991, and maybe with a little bit different arguments after 9/11 in our country, there was an assessment that the democratic order would just endure naturally, that the UN Charter could be self-preserving, and that naturally anyone or every country would grow to recognize the universal rights of their people because they were natural, and that just hasn't happened. Instead, in the past 10 years, there's been growing authoritarian threats, and many, many countries that were on the bubble in between, a liberal democracy and authoritarianism have backslid. And so it's incumbent upon all of us here to recognize the importance of actively promoting and defending our allies, and then working with democratic allies to counter this global trend.
It's a difficult one, and just a question to you, because you are a representative of the current U.S. government, of the Biden administration, and you are working with the Department of State. How does the Biden administration justify the thousands of people who've lost their lives in Gaza and Lebanon? Because the Arab Street certainly doesn't agree with what's happening there.
Absolutely. And first, I should just say that this is a real tragedy, and I think everyone in the U.S. government understands the loss of civilian life. The U.S. government strongly supported, after October 7th, the State of Israel, and continues to have ironclad support for the security of the State of Israel. And as Secretary Blinken has said again and again, far too many lives have been lost. And that runs through everything we do at the State Department in terms of our actions to protect civilian harm, to protect humanitarian access. We work every single day. But above all else, we are working tirelessly toward a ceasefire. And that is fundamentally a civilian protection, what we believe will be the best way to address the tragic loss of life.
So we heard earlier from the president calling repeatedly for a ceasefire, and then a report in Politico suggesting that members of his administration, Brett McGurk, Amos Hochstein, gentlemen that I've interviewed on a number of occasions, actually agreed with the Israelis on what's been happening in Lebanon, on this incursion, which has left thousands of people dead, that they gave the green light for it. How can you justify that?
So I would defer to the White House on the exact decision-making in terms of recent negotiations with the Israelis on Lebanon. I would just go back to the fundamental policy of the Biden.
Because thousands of people have died.
Yes.
Innocent civilians, women and children.
Which lays at the feet of Nasrallah, or Hassan Nasrallah, and also at the feet of Hezbollah.
General, with all due respect, a lot of people don't believe that, but go ahead.
Hell, a lot of people think the world is flat, but that doesn't mean that I agree with that.
I think the theme here, and this is what I was trying to speak about earlier, the danger is American weakness. So you have an isolationist drive on the, on a more passive side where we won't do things, versus a more active type of isolationism, or a more volatile, chaotic potential from the U.S. But in the case of the Middle East, General Petraeus mentioned this, we have not held Iran accountable. Iran has promoted these groups that have been attacking Israel, whether it's Hamas or Hezbollah or the Houthis that have been attacking not only them, but also international shipping. And you can look at the situation today and see we have escalating war in the Middle East. We have a 2.5-year war with no end in sight of Russia against Ukraine. We have growing risks in East Asia with China taking islands and threatening Taiwan. We've had Maduro just stand up to the U.S. and say, I'm not leaving. We have an escalating series of crises, and they're linked together. If you look at the way North Korea and Iran and China and Russia are all cooperating in ways that weren't true a couple of years ago, this is all, I think, a product of lack of willingness to confront problems and a perception of weakness. And that's the danger on that side. I may view that as the greater danger, but we also have to look at the danger of a volatile and chaotic American administration as well.
Yeah, I'd just like to back to the subject. First of all, to say that I think Paxes and polls and all this stuff is the seventh circle of hell of political scientists, and I think it's just stupid arguments. But I think there are at least three areas where America's power is both indisputably going to be strong and vital. We don't talk about nuclear at all. And what's not discussed is there's been an incredible transformation in the United States where almost nothing is bipartisan. So over a decade ago, we started with President Obama on a road to zero. We've not only abandoned the road to zero, that the idea of nuclear modernization is now completely bipartisan. The support for a triad is completely bipartisan. The recognition that the United States needs to have a nuclear deterrent that's sufficient to deal with both China, which is going to be equivalent to the US and Russia, and be able to deal with regional threats, including potentially breakout. This, I think, and adding to that, because an offense-defense mix is what really brings stability, is the recognition in the United States of the importance of missile defense and growing and expanding air defense. This, I think, is an incredible power that the United States brings to the table, which is dramatically important in global stability. Energy. We say the United States, but it's really the United States, Canada, and Mexico together are truly the world's global energy superpower. And if the United States unleashes an interest in putting as much affordable, reliable, dependable, abundant energy into the global system, that I think is powerful and transformative. And the other one, which we often don't talk about, is foreign direct investment. I think last year the numbers were like 14% decline in foreign direct investment in China. That's a lot of money, and it's got to go somewhere. And you couldn't even spend it all in the United States if you wanted to. That is a powerful instrument, and there are lots of places in the world, if you think about connecting all the potential free and open spaces together. Whether we're talking about building out the 3 Cs initiatives or building out the middle corridor and bringing the energy and resources and connecting that to the global market, or getting back to the Abraham Accords and joint development and expanding capacity of throughput through the Middle East or the Southern Corridor. I think American FDI is a truly transformative power that we really intend to tap. And those things, I do think, make a big difference. If you want to call that Pax Americana, whatever, but it's just the reality of what America is going to bring to the table, and that's indisputable, regardless of who's president of the United States.
That economic diplomacy is something that the United States at various times either leans into or seems to pull away from. But I wanted to get a show of hands in this room. Who believes that if there is a threat to Taiwan, America will come in and save the day? Raise your hand if you think that America will defend Taiwan. It's not a full house. Many, but not a full house. General?
My hand is in the air.
I see that, yes. What does that say to you, that not every hand is in the air?
It says that we need to, while still preserving our policy of, strategic ambiguity? We need to clarify that policy. I mean, look, this is why President Biden, on 4 occasions, not 1, 2, 3, 4, has seemed to slip up and say, we'll come to the aid of Taiwan. His national security advisor rushes out to the podium and says, there is no change to our policy of strategic ambiguity, but this is all trying to convey that we will indeed do that. Because again, as I mentioned earlier, you have to be really conscious of the elements of deterrence. assessment of capabilities on one hand and willingness to employ them on the other. And by the way, we've taken some actions in recent years, both administrations, by the way, both of the recent administrations, one of which decided to get out of Afghanistan, even though we had 2,500 troops, hadn't lost a soldier in 18 months, and was very affordable, and then the other which followed through. That sent quite a message. I think that was one of a number of factors that probably convinced Putin that he could do what he did and get away with it, which he obviously did not. Huge miscalculations in a number of different regards. I was in actually the office of the Prime Minister in Singapore when the red line in the Obama administration about chemical weapons use in Syria turned out not to be a red line. And he said, you know what, General? That has repercussions out in the South China Sea. So we've really got to be conscious. And again, the minister mentioned earlier, what happens in one part of the world reverberates in others. We need to be aware of that, because those, some running for office, who say, well, the Indo-Pacific, that's the priority. We can't do Ukraine and the Middle East and the Indo-Pacific. I think that's seriously wrong. If you show that you can't do Ukraine, why would they believe that you're going to do Indo-Pacific? And by the way, again, we're not fighting and dying in Ukraine. We're not fighting and dying on the ground in the Middle East. We're fighting certainly the Houthis. But that's a very different situation. Taiwan would be much more significant than that. So you've got to show that you're willing to do this if you're going to have anybody believe you about that.
No doubt about it. 2 days ago, I was in Moscow. I was sitting with the Deputy Prime Minister, who's also the Minister of Energy, a key architect of the OPEC Plus agreement with the Saudis. You may have seen the report a few days ago that perhaps the Saudis, after December, will again attempt to reclaim some market share. That, of course, could have serious repercussions for a petrodollar economy like Russia's. I asked him, you know, how painful could this get for you? On the heels of the fact that they're going to be spending 25, 30% more on their military. And he said, you know, we're okay until the lowest price. We can take the pain, was the answer. General, is that your assessment?
No, I think a gas station with guns, or nukes, as you might describe the Russian Federation, is in real trouble if the price of Brent crude drops substantially. By the way, I'm a little bit skeptical about this all happening. It's pretty low right now, and that's because, you know, it's a supply and demand issue. Demand hasn't come back the way people expected, particularly when it comes to China. And then you have the situation where the U.S. is already far and away, you know, the swing producer in the world now is the U.S. and actually Mexico and Canada together. The U.S. far and away produces more crude oil and natural gas than any other country in the world. We're now a net exporter of crude, which very few people thought would ever be the case. We're not totally self-sufficient. We have more light crude than we need, a bit more heavy crude for our refineries than we produce. But we're going to become potentially the largest LNG exporter, which no one thought either, in part because we didn't even have any liquefaction plants. We had regasification. So this is really remarkable. Yes, you know, permitting could be faster, but we're already at this position. Having had both Republican and Democratic administrations in recent years. Saudis are very conscious of that. I remember being asked when I was Central Command Commander, you know, can't you just tell Exxon and Mobil and Shell to stop producing as much as they are? And I said, you know, we sort of respond to market forces, not central direction. So, look, price goes down, Russia's in a tough spot. And by the way, the long-term damage to the Russian economy, I think, will take years to see, but this brain drain that has taken place, the exit of the oil majors, so they're not actually in the process right now of doing the really tough drilling through the permafrost and so forth to replace what is going to deplete in the years that lie ahead. But right now, they're still pretty strong, and as you noted, devoting enormous resources to their military, which is what is enabling them to continue to get incremental gains in the southeastern part of Ukraine, even though they're just losing really almost unimaginable numbers of soldiers for someone who spent almost every night in combat writing letters of condolence to America's mothers and fathers.
Kurt, I know that you've been on the front lines of this in many ways, but also as an advisor, in an advisory capacity. What do you say to those in Ukraine who are worried about either candidate winning this election simply because they think that we are getting into a situation where there's less capacity to support Ukraine?
Well, what I would say, I want to start with where General Petraeus left off. Not only is he right about the impact of lower prices on Russia, that should be our objective. We should be doing this. We should be ramping up our production of everything possible. We should be working with Saudi Arabia exactly to get them to do what they're thinking of, which is to increase their production as well. Our taking a more strategic approach toward Iran will be an essential part of getting Saudi Arabia to do that. But I think this has to be our goal. I mean, do you know that under the current U.S. policy, Russian banks are exempt from the application of U.S. sanctions if the payments are for energy? That's crazy. That should be our #1 target, is to go after those payments.
Some NATO allies had something to do with that, as you may recall.
But all because we are worried about the availability of supply, which we could be doing something about. So I think we have to reformulate this entirely. Having just come from Ukraine last week and multiple visits over the last couple of years, I'll just tell you, and Ukrainian friends in the audience here can chime in, but I perceive that Ukrainians are far more worried about more of the same than they are worried about a little bit of rolling the dice. Because more of the same is slow death to them.
James.
Look, I agree. This is something that I think we're all missing. And maybe Dave has a different view. I don't know, because we were both there on the front lines. But, I was there in the Cold War in '89. I think the frontier of NATO is more defensible today than it was during the Cold War. There's a lot more strategic depth. The correlation of forces is actually better now. And if you look at this from a Russian perspective, they have 1,000 more miles of frontier with some very capable militaries on the northern border. You have a Ukraine military, which is the largest army in Europe, which isn't going anywhere. And if Russia ever wants to attack NATO, what are they going to do? Drive by the Ukrainians and wave and say, hi, we're on our way to Latvia? I mean, that's not going to work. You've got a Polish military, which has made, I think, the most strategic and important defense commitment in all of NATO, because that is the cornerstone of a really almost impregnable NATO front line that they're building, and that's anchored on a very decent Romania thing. And to Kurt's point about that kind of active, we talked about this before, the active concern of the United States, I think for most it's like, we don't have a plan. We need a plan. And also, it's this notion, well, Europeans need to do more. And to be honest, and I think we're going to find this, is Europeans are doing more.
They are.
So that criticism is going to fade away. And the other thing is what do they actually need from the United States to ensure a defensible NATO frontier? And it's the things the United States is both capable and I think very willing to give. You want deep strike? So the Russians know that anything that gets to the NATO border dies before it crosses the border. You want more missile and air defense so you can protect your populations and you can protect your infrastructure. That is a strategic challenge that if the Russians want to try to match that on $80 a barrel of gas or whatever, in the next, that's a competition that they are going to lose.
Yeah, $70 gas. Or crude, Brent crude, that is, barrel.
Well, just to say, I agree with everything. I think the really important thing as well is you asked about what the Ukrainian people should think. I think that they should know from security forums like this that the resolve of NATO and the allies is to see it through to the end, and the Ukrainian people should hear that loud and clear, and so should the Russians. I think the point that all of us have made is the reason why we're so supportive of what's happening in Ukraine, and indeed Poland, the others on the Baltic, front line there, is because it is the front line. It's the defence of an illegal attack against freedom and democracy. And if it wins there, or is seen to win there, the repercussions will be across Europe, but also across the world, where aggression will seem to have won. And that's why it's so important, what we see happening now. And I tell you the miscalculation that Putin made. He thought when he attacked Ukraine, NATO would disintegrate and be weak. And in that sense, NATO has become stronger, particularly with the accession Finland and Sweden. And I think that message from the Warsaw Security Forum is really important, that defence of freedom and democracy, not only in Europe but across the world. And the Russians will see what's happening here, and that's the message that should go out to them. We're going to see this through to the end because we realise how important it is.
Putin set out... Putin set out to make Russia great again, and what he's actually done is make NATO greater.
I would just add to the people of Ukraine, just the depth of support in the U.S. government and among the American people that will continue. I cannot foresee what will happen in the election. Of course, I want my team, future President Harris, to win. I
got an answer.
I can only describe the incredible mobilization of diplomacy and foreign assistance that under President Biden and Vice President Harris has happened in my system. It has been remarkable to watch the organization of allies in Europe. It has been remarkable to watch the efforts on bolstering NATO. It has been remarkable to watch the efforts to get from working with the U.S. Congress $61 billion, and on and on and on. And then the diplomatic effort to use our own investments in the United States to try to increase the contribution and to successfully increase the security assistance contribution among NATO members. So on and on and on. This type of foreign policy does not go away, and it has been central to both our promotion of democracy, our understanding of our geopolitical presence, and whatever follows this Pax Americana moment, this new era, really will rest on this all-of-government effort to not only talk the talk, but to walk the walk with our work and our money.
Can I just really quickly add, the key about Poland is not only is this happening, it happened under a conservative government, and you had a very different government come in, and that exact same commitment is there, and that's extremely important. We're going to have elections in Romania. It doesn't matter. Romania is going to stay committed to modernization. The Finland and Swedish and Norwegian commitment is absolutely strong. These are very, very positive developments that really, I think, are much, much more transformative than where the exact line winds up when the fighting stops in Ukraine.
Just final question, and to this for Kurt. I asked this earlier today of the Georgian president. We're watching it in Georgia. We're watching it in Moldova and elsewhere, which is sort of the long arm of the Kremlin, whether it be through campaigns of misinformation or even people on the ground. How worrying is that to you when there's a perception, frankly, of American weakness?
It's very worrying. What I see is that Russia has a strategy not only for Ukraine, which is to attack it and try to take it over. They have a strategy for intimidating or flipping governments, both in the Caucasus, in Southeast Europe that are not NATO members, also some that are NATO members. And I don't feel that we have a strategy for taking that on and reversing it. That we ought to have a Russia rollback strategy. Which I don't see that we have. And, Dafna made a very strong case for the bipartisan and the strong support of the American people for Ukraine, which I agree with. It's very true. But what we see right now, and I say this as a former ambassador to NATO, is our allies wanting to do more. I see the Poles saying, let us defend our airspace. The Romanians, the same thing. I see everybody saying we got to get Ukraine into NATO because we have to send a strong signal to Putin about where this is going. We have the demand for let's give Ukraine the long-range things that they need. And it's the U.S. that is not joining consensus at NATO, which is new for me. And it's something that I think we have to try to reverse. We need, whether it's a President Harris or a President Trump, but we need to restore an internationalist-looking, a proactive American leadership aimed at pushing our interests in the world.
Hear, hear.
Panelists, thank you so much for joining us.